wherever you are. So that's sort of our agenda for today. And like Lindsay said, please do ask questions as we move along. We'll take them at the end to make sure we can move through everything. But we really, really appreciate your questions. So please don't hesitate to add them as we're going along. So I'll start off with the first section and talk about a fantastic report of ours called the State of the Secular States. I can see the blue reflected on my face. This is a report that we put out every year for the past 3 years, and it looks at all the laws and policies in every state, plus DC and Puerto Rico, pertaining to the separation of religion and government and religious equality. And it tracks about 40 different law and policy items in every state, including Arizona. And it's a really handy resource. It's great for advocates to see what the laws are currently in their state so they can understand, well, how do we make it better? What needs to be changed? And what can we do? What types of laws can we pass to sort of ensure that people have protections that they should have under the law? So it's hard to sort of measure and see where you are without without this kind of roadmap. Otherwise, how would you be able to compare and see what Arizona looks like compared to other states? So it's a really great basis, and it's available at atheist.org/states. I'm going to just exit out of this sharing real quickly and show you what the scorecard page looks like, so you can see that as well. Let's see here. All right, and share this. Okay, I think that works. Can you see it there? Perfect. So here's Arizona, and there's 3 different categories in the survey. I'm sorry, not the survey. In the State of the Secular States report, 3 different categories of states. Basically, there's the ones that are the most protective of the separation of religion and government and religious equality, those that are sort of in the middle, and those that have a lot of religious exemptions that undermine religious equality. And unfortunately, Arizona falls into that 3rd category with about 20 other states that have a lot of sort of holes in the barrier between religion and government. And so you can see we broke it out into different categories. Here, the simple sort of code is that if they are filled in circles, it means that the law exists. If it's blue, it's a good law. And if it's red, it's a bad one. So you can see there are good, for example, Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause protections in the state constitution, like there are in the federal constitution. And that's just to give you an idea. I won't go through them all here. I just want to show you where this is. You can also, there's also a PDF version that you can print out right here. If you want to go into a lawmaker meeting, you can actually print out a version of this. And then, this is the version from the larger PDF, and that way you can take it and talk about what the laws look like in your state with your lawmakers. So that can be really helpful. And there'll be a new version of this coming out in January, where we're adding a few new categories and updating, any laws that have changed from the previous year. So let me stop that, and I'll go back to the slides. Okay. How's that? Good? Perfect. Thanks, Brett. Appreciate it. Okay, so what is new in this report? Well, this year's version of the report added a few new things. Non-discrimination laws about religion, whether non-discrimination and religion is protected in areas like employment and public accommodations and education. And when I say non-discrimination based on religion, we mean based on religious beliefs. That applies to both religious and non-religious people. And that's an important aspect to understand. Also, really important this past year, we looked at homeschooling laws, because the vast majority of this country has very poor or no homeschooling laws, meaning that there's very few requirements that have to be in place and very little oversight about what students are actually being taught, which can result in people not getting the education that they need to thrive as adults. And in some cases, it can let abuse sort of fester. And so it's really important that there be homeschooling laws. And unfortunately, most states do not have very strong ones. And there's a few other areas looked at as well. And like I mentioned previously, the new one assessment coming out in January will have even more of these assessments. I'm just going over this as like a brief overview. And here are the state rankings I talked about previously. because I wanted to highlight what Arizona looks like. Now, I just wanted to highlight a few of the laws and policies that Arizona has compared to several others. So like other states, Arizona has constitutional protections that are similar to the US Constitution, including a establishment clause and a free exercise clause. It also is one of the few states where constitutional protections such as the requirement to fund, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to skip that. It also has unfortunately, it has very few protections against religious-based harm. And by that we mean areas where, religion sort of impels, we see a lot of religious people sort of target or use their beliefs to attack other types of people. Like, for example, protections against religious-based harm. We think of things like laws against conversion therapy. That makes sense. Conversion therapy is the practice of sort of therapists trying to convince LGBT people that they need to change because of their beliefs. It's usually shame-based. It can be very damaging. And so laws, but it's often driven by religion. And the same for things like female genital mutilation. Those are sorts of things that are often driven by religion. And we often try to sort of say, we should have protections in place to prevent those things from coming, from being in place in the States. So there's very few of those in Arizona, unfortunately. Things like laws against child marriage, against conversion therapy, and against educational neglect through homeschooling. However, there are numerous laws inserting religion into schools, and this is one of the areas where Arizona does the worst, unfortunately. We saw, for example, they have active insertion of religious ideas into schools, for example, abstinence-only education. Even where education, sex education is offered, it must be abstinence-only. And, unfortunately, Arizona has very limited laws that allow for sex education. I'm sorry, that beeping. I just need to shut that off. Okay. Apologies. And also another area is laws to encourage Bible school classes. So Arizona has laws in place, for example, that will encourage schools to offer Bible school classes. And we're not talking about broader sort of comparative religion classes. We're talking about classes focused on the Christian Bible or the Old Testament, which is sort of not very pluralistic or inclusive. And there are other types of policies like that as well. There is lack of sufficient protections for youth being homeschooled. There are also non-medical exemptions to vaccination in Arizona. So, for example, people can opt out of receiving vaccination based on religious beliefs, or in some cases, in some states, just the personal beliefs of parents, or students. So they don't even really need to have religious beliefs. They could just say that they object to vaccination. But Arizona does allow these kinds of opt-outs to vaccination. And here we're not talking about, COVID vaccination. We're talking about the types of typical vaccination that students have to get before going to public school, like measles, mumps, and rubella, and other types of vaccination like that. And of course, there's also vouchers and tax credits. This is an area where we've seen Arizona is contemplating even more harmful laws in that area. We generally object to those because they shift money away from public schools and usually give them to private education, which is very, very often religiously based. The vast majority of private schools are religious. And so you end up with a system where the money is not going to the public schools that serve everyone, but instead to a system of private schools where favor people that are religious and also serve to indoctrinate people into that religion. In terms of religious exemptions, Arizona has a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a type of law that can be used to sort of justify religious exemptions in different areas of state law. where basically the religious organization says that it burdens their beliefs. So that sort of can create requirements for accommodation of religion almost anywhere in Arizona law. So we generally object to those, and about 20 states have those around the country. There's also allowances to deny medical care relating to abortion and contraception based on religious beliefs in Arizona. Really famously, and I think Secular AZ really called this into light, but Arizona famously surreptitiously diverted over $1 million in specialty license plate revenue for, basically specialty license plates in Arizona to ADF, Lions Defending Freedom. So that's an issue we track too. In the state of the secular states, is money, is the state using these sort of systems to shift money to religious organizations, and in Arizona's case, even a hate group. And so that was something that's really important, that's worth noting in Arizona. What's notable here is that the number of bad laws that Arizona has on the books and also is at risk of passing. We're going to be talking about what this current session looks like in a moment. But Arizona is actually a very closely divided state politically. I think the Senate is only held by like a one person majority in terms of Republican versus Democrat. And yet we see, frankly, compared to many other states, it's a lot more divisive in terms of the policies we're seeing. And we're seeing a lot more extreme policies than in the vast majority of states that aren't like, famously battleground states like Texas or Arkansas. So I'll talk about this in a moment. A lot of the bills that were bad did not pass, but it is worth noting that we are seeing a lot of extreme, legislation in the state. And after working with you folks in Arizona, I can definitely tell it's a real fight every year to keep these bills from passing. And so there's really important work being done in the state to sort of limit these efforts. So let's talk about what happened in the legislature in 2021 in Arizona. And before I get started, I really, really have to recognize the work of Tori Roberg, who was, worked with American Atheists this past spring, helping us get through the legislative session, and was just a phenomenal, person to both have on the ground and also help with our national work. So really a lot of the work we were able to do in Arizona was thanks to her sort of hard building on connections, her paying attention to the issues, and really being out there and devoting her time and energy to fighting these things. So really it's worth appreciating everything she's doing, and you all are very lucky to have her in Arizona. So let's talk about some of the things we saw. These are general trends across the country. First of all, we saw a large wave of public health religious exemptions. So for example, when this is usually dealing with COVID, if the governor or the state legislature says, has a mask mandate out or limits gatherings, we saw more than 30 different state bills, I think maybe 40, where basically they say that these restrictions do not apply to churches or religious gatherings. And so we create this sort of odd loophole in the law where everybody is required to mask, or everyone, you're not allowed to have public gatherings of any kind except for church gatherings. And, it's just this unfortunate religious exemption, but we saw a number of states move forward with those. And there was a really particularly bad one that was proposed in Arizona, which I'll talk about more in a minute. Also, there was a wave of school vouchers and tax credit bills. And I mentioned why that's negative a few moments ago, because it diverts money away from public schools to private religious ones. And that really flowed from a Supreme Court decision the year before called Espinoza. And so I won't go into detail there, except that the reason we're seeing more of those than we have in previous years is because of a decision by the Supreme Court. We saw a huge number of anti-LGBTQ bills across the country this year, and the vast majority of them were focused on attacking trans youth, either sort of limiting their ability to participate in sports or their ability to receive appropriate medical care. And so there was just, dozens of those bills across the country, and a number of them passed. So the only time one of those bills had passed previously was the year before in Idaho. And yet this past year in 2021, we saw a much greater number of these pass, and they're being challenged in the courts as we speak, they are being pushed back in the courts, but it's still sort of, it's very unclear what's going to be happening as area of law in the future. And we're certainly going to be seeing more anti-LGBT bills in the coming year. And also we saw other religious exemptions in healthcare. One thing that's a notable trend is we're seeing very, very broad denials of care. And denials of care are when basically a healthcare facility or medical provider basically opt to not provide certain types of medically necessary care based on their beliefs. And I don't think most people know that this happens, but it really does happen quite often, usually in areas relating to abortion, contraception, end-of-life care, or LGBTQ care. So those are areas where it most happens. Now, Arizona already has some denial of care laws on the books. For example, the opting out of providing abortion care. But in some states, particularly Arkansas and in Ohio, they passed extremely broad bills that allow them to any medical provider, any person who works for a medical provider, including like a janitor, to be able to opt out of providing any sort of care, not just limited to those things, but anything that they morally disagree with. And that includes even insurers. So like an insurer, and that includes like employers as well, because employers often provide insurance. So basically, you could end up in a situation where your employer decides to opt out of providing coverage for certain types of conditions or things like that. So it's really worrisome. And we saw a number of these bills across the country last year, and they're very concerning. We're really hopeful we don't see more of those this year. And also, we saw a number of non-medical vaccination exemption bills, like I mentioned before, that Arizona has. So we saw sort of more of these, like expanding exemptions to vaccination requirements in different areas. There was one state, gosh, I can't remember which one, I'm sorry. It really, I think they just proposed actually repealing all vaccination requirements for public schools. And that's something that every state has. And yet they propose repealing it just because of this culture war stuff around COVID vaccination. So it's really unbelievable. So I'm not sure if that's going to move forward or if we'll see more of those, but we are sort of seeing some lawmakers attempt to poke holes into vaccination requirements just for typical vaccination that people get to go to school. So those are the waves of negative legislation we saw. Specifically talking about Arizona, and this is just a selection of bad bills. There's more I could have pulled on. I just want to give you guys a picture. And you'll see on here quickly, only 2 of these actually, well, I guess 3 of these actually passed in comparison to all the bills that there's more than this that actually are proposed that are negative bills. So that brings up a really good point, which is the vast majority of negative bills do not pass. But we have to fight to stop them. It's critical to fight to stop them, or else they will pass. And some of these bills did not pass because of the efforts of advocates, of lobbyists, of all the organizations working with you all and other folks in Arizona to stop them. So when we in Secular Arizona and other groups send action alerts to ask you to take action, that really does help. And that's one of the reasons we're able to stop some of these really bad pieces of legislation. So let's start at the top. There was a really bad anti-sex education bill, HB 2035, that makes discussion of sexuality of any kind. It was already opt-in, and you had to basically, your parent has to opt you into sex ed in Arizona, which is bad policy. It should be opt-out. Like your parents would have to say, no, I don't want to receive sex education, not that, yes, I need to receive it, because that sort of makes less people get sex ed. So that's already bad. But now they added a requirement where it's any discussion of sexuality at all in school requires opt-in. So, if they discuss it in biology class, if they talk about, the way sexuality is sometimes framed, if they talk about LGBTQ people, that could be assumed to be sexuality, like an anti-bullying course. So it's not clear how this applies, but it creates sort of a mess, which makes it harder for schools to run these types of programs. It prohibits any sex ed before grade 5, limits sex education for charter schools, so they also cannot have sex education. it makes much more onerous rules for schools that do want to offer sex ed. So it just places all these barriers in front of schools, which they hope will just throw up their hands and say, okay, well, this is too difficult. We don't want to do it, because that's the goal, to not offer sex ed at all. Unfortunately, that passed. So that's sort of where that is. But it's one of the things that, you know, we are concerned about in Arizona and across the country. Another bill, oh, it was in Arizona. The bill I was concerned about that eliminates school vaccination requirements. There it is, 2065 in Arizona. This did not pass, fortunately, but it's crazy, right? It's crazy that the entire point is a public health matter. You want to make sure that people get vaccination, and this is one of the best ways to ensure that they do it, to protect everyone's children, because some people just cannot get vaccinated for medical reasons. So this ensures that the majority of people do get vaccinated. Fortunately, this did not pass. Another issue we watch very closely, and this has been going on for several years, is that there's been an effort to divert money to crisis pregnancy centers, which are sort of fake clinics that basically they're pro-life. They try to incentivize women not to seek out abortion by and they often use lying or deceitful techniques to do so. There was an effort to divert, I think, $1.5 million for 2 years. So $3 million to these organizations in this bill. It did not pass, but this has been proposed for the last few years. So we'll likely see it again next year. The bill I'll come back to in a second is 2648. I'll come back to that. Private school tax credits. So that's, again, school vouchers, like I talked about a moment ago. 1482, it's amazing. So there's been effort across the country to limit conversion therapy and to pass laws against conversion therapy to protect LGBTQ young people. This bill does the opposite. It prevents regulators of professions from taking any action against one that provides counseling consistent with their religious beliefs. So if any professional provides counseling consistent with their religious beliefs, no matter what it is, they cannot be regulated or sort of, held accountable. So, I mean, you can probably just imagine all sorts of problems there. It could very much result in child abuse and other types of negative outcomes. Fortunately, it did not pass, but it's kind of scary that sort of thing is proposed because the effects of it are pretty obvious. And then we saw the last few are bills about anti-diversity education. So there's a lot of, concern, sort of a moral panic right now going on around what they're calling critical race theory. And there's a lot of bills passing in some places in the country are being proposed that sort of are supposed to limit critical race theory. The truth is, critical race theory is not being taught anywhere in grade school in the country. But what these laws do is really limit the ability of schools to address and teach about diversity and have diversity and inclusion in their curriculums. And so there were several bills that were passed in Arizona, sort of, unfortunately, as part of this trend. And they prohibit teaching about race or sex in ways that are designed to limit teaching about diversity. And the ones passed in Arizona have very, very punitive fines, unfortunately. There was another bill that did not pass, which is SB 1532, that would have imposed the fines not on the school district, but on the teachers themselves, which is even worse. So anyway, those are some of the bad bills that passed this year, and I'm happy to talk more. I'm going to try to move through it. The one bill I did want to mention was what we're calling a religious liability shield. So I talked a little bit about how there are public religious exemptions to public health protections like masking and limitations on gatherings. So under the guise of sort of allowing religious worship and religious organizations to meet, they proposed this extremely broad but very sneaky bill that basically would have granted immunity to civil and criminal liability to religious organizations in connection with their exercise of religion. So as long as they're acting within their religious beliefs, they could claim immunity for all sorts of, bad things that there are laws against, civil or criminal laws against, including things like that. I have a few examples here. Could claim immunity from child abuse or negligence for religious schools because they're acting within their religious mission, right? Broad immunity from labor and civil rights laws for religious organizations. Religious hospitals not being liable for consequences when they put beliefs before patients. Those are just some examples. And, you know, it's hard to sort of argue against a bill like this because it's just so broad and so unclear what the bill does, but it was being framed as allowing the churches to meet, and it's much, much broader. Fortunately, a really great coalition was able to come together with lots of different organizations in Arizona and push back against this bill hard, and it did not pass, but it was very, very close for a while. And you know, it can really, we were just concerned about this causing havoc in the law because no one really knows what it means in the long term when this sort of, I don't know, experimental legislation is proposed. So let's change the page, talk about some good Arizona bills. There was a medical aid in dying bill proposed, a bill to prohibit conversion therapy as well, a really good sex education bill, an LGBTQ non-discrimination bill, a bill about healthcare transparency. And this is the type of issue that we've been working on around the country, but Arizona was one of the states that actually pioneered this to say that when there is denial of care, when providers, you know, don't want to provide certain types of care based on their beliefs, they have to actually inform the patient. They can't just sneak it, you know, not talk about it or like just spring it on a patient. They have to inform them ahead of time and also tell the Department of Health so they can make a public statement about it and have it on their website so people can understand what healthcare options are actually available to them. So that's really important. And Arizona was one of the states that sort of started that. And we're working in 5 or 6 other states across the country on those types of bills. And another bill that actually is getting a bit of attention is the clergy duty to report abuse. The lawmaker, the senator, I don't recall her name off the top of my head, she actually spoke on a webinar for other lawmakers recently about these types of bills and her experiences with abuse by clergy. And she was just phenomenal. It helped explain the need for these types of bills across the country. So I really appreciated her efforts. And a couple other states are actually expressing interest in this now as well. So there's some of the positive bills that passed. Now, I'm sorry, that were introduced. None of these have passed, but you know, I talked about how close the legislatures are in Arizona. So I think it's worth noting that these are bills that had the very much a potential to pass in the future. I'm gonna maybe stop and not go into this in detail because I mentioned this a second ago, the Patients' Right to Know Act, but I want to give Brett enough time to speak. So I am going to stop here and pass it over to you, Brett.
All right, thanks, Allison. It's great to be with you all. As said at the beginning, I'm Brett Parker. I'm the State Policy Manager with American Atheists. Before that, I spent 5 years in the Kansas House of Representatives as a state rep and was a public school teacher before that. So I just want to talk a little bit about, you know, Allison kind of gave the landscape of what's going on in Arizona. What have we seen before? If these are things that you feel strongly about, you know, either stopping bad legislation or helping to support good legislation, what is it that you as a person in Arizona can do? So a handful of things. One is you can follow along with some of these bills. So on our website, atheist.org, there's a state legislation tracker. As we see bills introduced, we try and flag them. You can find them state by state that way. You can also go to the legislative website, and state legislative websites are not always the most user-friendly, but if you spend a little bit of time with them, you can usually manage all right. They're a good way to find contact information for various legislators, navigate committees and things like that. We'll get into that as well. You can contact legislators directly, and I like that note, even the friendlies. Sometimes being the voices standing up against bad legislation can get a little bit lonely, or you just get worn down, right? Whether you're a legislator who's standing up for what's right, or you're an activist, or you're someone whose family is directly affected, you know, wave after wave of bad legislation can really wear you down, and it's worth being in contact and supportive of people who are being friendly. If you want to get involved directly in the hearings of bills, you can write testimony as a group or as an individual. That's part of my job, is submitting testimony on behalf of American Atheists. But we also love it when there are folks on the ground who we can empower to do that, help write the testimony, and coach folks up for that. Yeah, don't stop talking or writing about the bills. You have your circle of influence within the state of Arizona, and it's worth using to stop bad things from happening and to support good ones. And if you're ever coming to Phoenix, you can testify in person, or just drop into the State House and take meetings with lawmakers. Talk to, especially if they are your lawmakers, talk to them about what's important to you. If there's a bill coming up that really matters to you, whether it's something positive you want to advance or something you're worried about passing, schedule a meeting with them. We'll get into that a little bit as well. Also, if you don't mind, there we go. Okay, so I mentioned the Arizona State Legislature website. I don't want to spend too much time on this because, like I said, it's fairly intuitive, but you can use this website to find bills, find and contact lawmakers. If you find you're a lawmaker, you can look at what committees they're on. If you find a committee you're interested in, you can kind of track their agenda. So if you have a small homework assignment from this and you're interested in what goes on in the Arizona State Legislature, a good first place to start is just to spend a few minutes on the website and start poking around there. Find your lawmaker, pick a committee. Right now, they're not up to much until January, but you can kind of look at some of the things that happened in 2021. So if you want to jump in and contact your legislator, there's a few different options. Email is nice and easy. If you're not the most social person or you're a little bit more introverted, sometimes it's easy to try and do that first outreach by email. It's remarkably easy to call legislative offices. Availability may change around the year depending on whether folks are in session or not and what the staffing looks like. But for example, when in my office, when I was a lawmaker in Kansas, if people called me, they really called with my office assistant. And in Kansas, it was primarily very nice retired folks who just wanted a job for a few months a year while the legislature was in session. And it didn't matter if you called, the most friendly legislator or the most hostile legislator. You usually got to talk with a very nice office assistant who would either take down what you wanted to say or help you schedule a meeting. A lot of legislators are thrilled to have the option now of doing virtual meetings. It makes it a lot easier to connect with people without having to take as much time out of the day. So while it might have been difficult in the past to try and get a legislator to meet with you either in the State House or back in their district or come to an event, now they can just say, you know what, I've got 10 minutes on my calendar, here's a Zoom link, or you can propose that as well, and that makes it a little bit easier. And then when I first started out as a legislator, I always quote this, and I really wish I remember who first said it, but someone gave a very general rule for people trying to do advocacy is, in general, the impact your advocacy has corresponds pretty directly to the effort. So you might see different options to sign your, the easiest thing, and we'll talk about this later, is getting action alerts, signing your name onto an email and sending it out to your legislator. It's very, very easy. It has an impact. We legislators notice when they get those. But if you take the effort to call the office, that's going to get a little bit more notice. If you have the opportunity to actually do an in-person meeting with a legislator, that is about the highest impact. Now, I know those things take more effort, they take more time. But if there's something you're really passionate about, I'd highly recommend start with those email action alerts and kind of build from there. Try and get to know your legislators and schedule a meeting with them. And then last point on here is during the legislative session, your legislators are probably in Phoenix. Sorry, I almost said Topeka there. My Kansas bias showing here. But outside the session, or even on the weekend sometimes, they'll be back in your community, right? So you don't have to live near Phoenix to take a meeting with a legislator. You can reach out to them, especially this fall leading up to next session, and try and get a meeting sometime in the next couple of months if there's something you want to talk about. And if they have a district office, meet them there. In Kansas, I always laughed when people asked if I could meet at the district office because it was my my district office was my kitchen table in my apartment. But there was a coffee shop around the corner, and that was an easy place for me to meet with folks when they reached out. Let's jump ahead to if you're actually talking with lawmakers. I think this is a thing that can be easily intimidating if you've not done it before. When I signed up to run for office, I kind of had this naive idea that as someone who is kind of a big political nerd, that in Kansas there's 125 House members, I thought I'm going to go join the 124 other most passionate public policy, nerds from the state of Kansas, and everyone's just going to be super devoted to that, and I will just sit in the back as the new person and learn from all of these people who've spent their whole lives thinking about public policy. In reality, lawmakers, especially at the state level, they're just people from their community. They might have had a history in politics, or they might have just been someone prominent in the community who a party reached out to and said, hey, we think you do a really good job with this. And they had the capacity to sign up and do it. So I guess first and foremost, don't be intimidated. Most state legislators do something else for a living before they started doing it, or they're doing it as retirement or taking time off. But they're just people from your community. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of speaking to legislators, especially around issues that can be this passionate. There is a place for speaking truth to power, and I don't ever want to discourage anyone from speaking their truth, but I want to talk to you a little bit about how do the people who get paid lots and lots of money talk to legislators? What do they find effective? What are sort of their practices, I guess? So the first thing I would say is professional lobbyists don't yell or bully, right? They will lose their job in a hurry if that is how they approach their advocacy. And this is true of, sort of what we think of maybe sometimes as like the evil contract lobbyists who have 50 different clients. I don't actually think they're evil, but or like the lobbyists that I knew in Kansas who their almost sole job was lobbying for Medicaid expansion. It doesn't matter. They know that their job is to be helpful to legislators, to be friendly, to be a resource. And you can do the same as you kind of grow in reaching out to folks. It's worth noting that even legislators who you disagree with the most, they are probably proud of their service and they think they're trying to accomplish good for their state. We might think they're wrong and truly believe they're wrong, but there are very few who actually think, that they are just cynically causing destruction upon their state and this is how they want to spend their time. So it's worth trying to understand and get to know why are they serving, what brought them there, and see if you can find any connection. This is, if there's one takeaway from talking with state legislators, I want to make this point. It's share your stories. You don't have to be the policy expert to make an impact. In fact, there are probably other folks who can do that, or the legislators and their staff are going to read the ins and outs of the bill and the policy, hopefully. But what they'll remember from conversations with people are personal experience in your stories. So part of that is giving them context for how a bill might impact someone. But the other part of it, just for you as an advocate building a relationship with the lawmaker, is that they really get to know you as a real person who cares about your community. It's easy to sort of caricature folks who agree with us or disagree with us in the abstract, but once you're there and you're telling a real life story, or you're doing it over Zoom, or even just a personally written email, then it becomes a lot more clear that you're a real person, even if you disagree with them, who has a story to tell. So stories. You don't have to be the policy expert. Along the same lines, it's worth finding common ground whenever it's possible. This is really, again, what the professionals will do. If you are hired as a lobbyist, you're trying to, win votes for whatever the next bill is, but that's not the whole ball game. They also know that they're going to continue working with these legislators for at least a couple years in some cases, but Frankly, most state legislators, just like most members of Congress, live in districts that are fairly safe and they can keep doing the job for a long time. So it's worth always approaching an issue knowing that it's not going to be the last one you're ever going to speak to this person about. That's not to say you can't disagree or voice your opinion passionately, but it's worth doing so in a way that lets you continue to be a credible advocate moving forward. Just one of the reasons why it's so effective to share stories, right? You can't, no one's going to dispute, hopefully, no one's going to dispute your personal experience, right? They may not find it as moving as you would like it to be on an individual bill, but hopefully it's genuine and they take that to heart. And so that if there's another bill on the topic later that maybe they're less certain about and you reach back out, they'll remember your story. You can kind of pick up where you left off and keep going from there. Okay, so this is a big thing as well. If you get a meeting, whether it's Zoom, in person, you're in the Capitol, you're in the district, it's worth showing up early. Be prepared and respectful of time, especially during the legislative session. Legislative schedules can be chaotic. I did that, I was in the legislature for 5 years. Even my last year, there were days where I couldn't tell you what time I was going to be free, 1 hour to the next, because in the House, we knew we had, X number of things to vote on, but the timing was going to be, we had to wait for the Senate to do something, or we had to wait for the staff to print and hand out all the bills at a certain time. And not all of those things fit nicely into the calendar. And even on the more structured days, sometimes committee hearings run long. Sometimes someone corners you in the hallway when you're trying to get back to your office for a meeting. It can be chaotic. So don't take that personally. Just be flexible and respectful of that. And the biggest thing ever I can say, be nice to the staff. If I ever heard someone being rude to the very nice office assistant outside of my office, the chances that I was going to, be ready to listen and support what people coming in to advocate for supported were much less. And again, that goes back to just building long-term relationships and being, credible, genuine people. You might disagree on that bill, but hopefully they'll remember what a nice person you were. So there's a few tools and resources at hand as well. And Allison talked about this a little bit. If you want to look at some of those state reports, you can do so on our website. It's worth mentioning Project Blitz is a Christian nationalist effort to really pass a lot of the bills that we oppose, frankly, to insert religion into public spaces. And so blitzwatch.org is a website that American Atheists participates in to help track some of those efforts to make sure that we are shedding light on a really coordinated effort to do so across multiple states. We'll see, very similar language bills introduced all over. And so we want to make sure that those things are being opposed as they ought to be, and that light is being shed on them. So blitzwatch.org is a great place if you're worried about some of those Christian nationalist efforts to push really religious extreme ideas and really just tear down the separation of church and state is really the goal there. Like I said before, you can do bill tracking on atheist.org. We look at bills that are filed in legislatures, flag them. You can look at them state by state. And then a secularsurvey.org is a great place to look at a survey of nearly 34,000 non-religious people that we commissioned to look at, what does our community look like, right? And that's incredible information to be able to bring towards meetings with elected officials, right? They need to know this too, that we are part of their communities and who they represent and what this looks like.
Can I just add there on that one, Fred?
Yes, please.
But we just released a new report yesterday focusing on Black non-religious Americans based on that data. So that is also on that site. We released it just yesterday. It's hot off the presses. It's a really, really great report. So check that out too.
Absolutely. It is a really great report. And then Allison, do you mind going to the last one or next one here too? if you're interested in getting updates from us about what's going on in Arizona, there's a couple of things you can do. If you want to see that 2020 report for your state and be able to be automatically prompted it to send it to your state legislators and let them know, here's what our community looks like. You can text states to that number. Alternatively, if you just want to sign up for the action alerts so that if we know that there's a good bill or a bad bill in Arizona that has a hearing coming up and we want to make sure everyone reaches out to their state legislator, that's an easy way to do that as well. And with that, I also kind of want to just step back and talk a little bit about what we do, Allison and I, and how it relates to the advocacy you might be doing. There's two of us, and Allison also oversees our legal department, right? So we're about 1.5 full-time staff here for state advocacy. We track, all 50 states plus Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. So it is not the same as having, a full-time staff member on the ground in every state house. So a lot of what we do is work with volunteers and advocates on the ground in various states. In a few states, we started state advocacy teams where we have a group of volunteers that meets about once a month specifically to talk about advancing positive legislation, to get bills introduced, and then to work to oppose negative legislation. Arizona is one of the states we're looking to develop that in as well. So if that's something you're really passionate about and would like to be a part of, by all means, reach out to Allison and I, and our email addresses are on there. But even in states where we don't have that team together, we help, draft testimony, and we want to equip people on the ground to do that work because you all know your communities, and you are the constituents of the lawmakers we're trying to reach. And as Allison said before, with the very narrow margins in the Arizona state legislature, you guys have the tremendous ability to impact the outcomes of things. Advocacy matters, but it can be hard work, and you don't win every battle, but you win at the margins over and over and over again. And when you're in a state like Arizona, where the margins are already so small, it just amplifies what you're doing. So, if there's a bad bill in the Senate and it looks like it's going to be about party line, 1 or 2 senators who are convinced can be the difference. Or more broadly than that, the majority party wants to stay the majority party. So if they are collectively hearing that a bill is not popular or not supported or not fair, they're going to think twice about whether they end up running that on the floor or trying to advance it, because even if they know they can secure, 50% plus one in the legislature, they're going to think twice about doing it if they think it may become an issue for them, come the next election. So I really just want to reinforce that in Arizona, you guys are tremendously positioned to have an outsized influence on advancing good policy and stopping bad policy. And that's worth taking advantage of and being as active as you can while we've got that. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and we really wanted to, open it up for questions and see if you all have any thoughts on, what can be done in Arizona moving forward or what's happened thus far.
Thank you, Allison and Brett. If you do have questions for either of them, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you could also raise your hand. At the bottom of your screen, you have a little hand option that will allow you to put your hand up. Well, I have a question.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I just have a question. Given what's going on in Texas, do you think a lot of states are going to try to replicate that sort of law? Are we going to start seeing that happen everywhere?
Yeah.
Yes, we're going to see it happen in a lot of places, unfortunately. We're already seeing it happen, being proposed. We're already seeing draft bills in places like Florida and Ohio and Arkansas. So yes, but I don't know if people saw this just a few minutes ago. A court actually stated in Texas, we're not sure if that's going to stay or, if it's going to be overturned by the Fifth Circuit, but it's a legally developing area. For people who don't know, what happened is they passed a bill in Texas about abortion. that basically limits any abortion after 6 weeks. And they did it in such a way as to try to get around people's constitutional rights, to make it so that it cannot be stopped based on the constitutional protections for abortion that courts have interpreted to be there for decades. And they're trying to get around federal and state protections for the Constitution. So there's nothing limiting that approach to abortion. It's a very scary approach because if you basically try to override the principles that sort of govern our laws, there's no stopping point, right? Yeah, it could be useful on anything, right? So it's not something, I feel like eventually they're going to realize that's not a mechanism that can possibly exist in our society. The question is where we'll end up about this particular issue. But regardless, I think we are going to see a lot of these bills in the short term. Whether one will be in Arizona, I can't say at the moment.
It's worth, the thing that comes to mind for me too is it's hard to get a lot of attention as a state legislator or make a name for yourself. And most legislators are in districts where their most competitive race is likely to be their primary. And it's like the easiest thing in the world if you are a conservative lawmaker who wants their constituents to know that you're as conservative as they come, is to file the thing that's already in the news. And so I'm guessing in many states we're going to see a rush for who can be the first one to do it and try and get a headline for themselves, and unfortunately make a name for themselves as the most extreme on that issue, so that they'll be safe in their next primary.
Yeah, and we're seeing that in all sorts of areas, like the anti-trans youth bills, the anti-diversity education bills. I mean, that's one of the reasons we're seeing this replicated. So I think that's a really good point, Brett.
Just reading a comment that our legal director, Diane Post, just put in the chat saying, Kathy Herod, who leads the Center for Arizona Policy, has already said she's shopping it. So it will show up here in AZ. Well, I know it's late where you are, and I don't want to keep you any longer. So thank you so much. That was really great information, really interesting. I love that you gave us some actionable things that we could do here to keep fighting for separation of church and state in Arizona. And I would just encourage everybody, we have a kind of fun thing going on at Secular AZ. We have a little contest going on our website. We've put up some of our favorite invocations, both secular and non, from across the country. And let me just share my screen real quick here. And if you have a few minutes, take a look and tell us which one you like the best. You can vote with your dollars, cast a vote for $1 each for whichever one you like the best. So I'm curious to see which one will be our constituents' favorite. But thank you all so much for coming, and especially to Allison and Brett for being here tonight. Everyone have a good night.
Thank you for inviting us.
Bye-bye.